My aunt left me everything. At the funeral, my parents, who abandoned me 15 years ago, smiled like nothing had happened. I just told them, "No more bills for you," and walked out. I was made a millionaire the day I held the ballot box. A lawyer with the face of an evening host read the names and numbers and reminded me where to sign, and the door opened without a knock. Two people I had once called Mom and Dad walked onto the carpet. They smiled like neighbors stopping by for sugar, and looked around the office as if in a shop window. The safe, the painting, my desk. I noted an odd detail. My mother stood so that the security camera captured her profile. "We just want to be supportive," she said friendly. Sounds beautiful, if you don't know that the only thing they know how to support is their own self-interest. I replied, "Condolences are accepted in writing." Nathan Caldwell, our lawyer, coughed and continued. "A mansion, a business, 2 million, an envelope marked open with lawyer." And the silence in which you could hear someone else's mask fall. I haven't forgotten the smell of the day I was left behind. Back then the kitchen smelled like lemonade, corn syrup and fried chicken. My father joked, my mother's earrings glittered, and I drew with crayons on the tile, unaware that the chalk would draw a border. At night they left. On the table, a note saying they'd be back when things got better. In the morning I made myself some oatmeal, couldn't reach the cans on the top shelf, and realized for the first time that I was an adult, because there was no one else. 24 hours later, Evelyn Shaw walked into the house. Strict jacket, perfect seams, a look that measured the distance from disorder to order. She didn't comfort or promise that the world was a kinder place. She opened the refrigerator, dumped out the sour milk and said, "You're not a project, you're a person. People eat hot and go to bed on time." Everything had a place in her house, even my tears. Not before bed. "We'll talk in the morning and decide." That same night I learned a new phrase. No is a complete sentence. Cold is not hostility. It is the temperature at which steel hardens. Since then, my life has been a set of steps. The first was grammar school. Rising at 6, running along the embankment, math with a tutor. The second was work. An internship in logistics under someone else's name. Night shifts in a warehouse and counting pallets instead of novels. The third was voice. I demanded transparency for the port on the city council, and realized it was possible to stand on stage without flinching. I'd come home thinking, Evelyn didn't give me life. She gave me everything else. Back to the study. My mother adjusted her scarf and asked in the tone of a curtain salesman, "And what are you going to do with that burden of responsibility?" Greg smiled in his family way. "We're around if you need us. We know people who know how to manage assets." I looked at Nathan and he looked at me, and we both knew, blood is not a loyalty program. He voiced it legally. There are no third-party roles in the documents. Mother pretended not to hear. My father kindly offered to drive me home and kindly discuss how to set things up so that no one would be offended. What a kindness, so much care right after 15 years of radio silence. It was quiet in the cemetery. I set out the roses and counted my breaths. Evelyn gave support without too many words. Hot soup, paid tuition, checklists where care looked austere. Her love sounded like a plan. Enroll, study, defend the project, and don't look back. When Linda emerged at the graveside in her new beige coat, it wasn't the words I heard, but the tone designed for an audience. "We're here, daughter. We've always been there in heart." A heart, it turns out, is a long-distance heart but with a very strange route. In the evening they showed up at my house like couriers without an order. Linda looked at the pictures like a showcase of other people's accomplishments. Greg sat on the edge of the chair as if measuring it for credit. "We want to help," they both repeated. "With what exactly?" I asked. They spoke of tough times, of a little bridge to a paycheck, of old friends and investments. The set is familiar. Guilt as an argument, urgency as an excuse, kinship as a password. I put the coffee down and said without raising my voice, "You were DNA donors." She became a mother. The air became as heavy as wet plaid. They were still juggling the words together and family, but the words fell before they reached me. Nathan called at 9 sharp. His voice always sounds like he's reading the forecast. "Clear, no precipitation. Make all contacts, don't transfer anything, keep the boundaries," he said. I wrote down the time, saved the calls, and turned off the porch light as if I'd pulled down the curtain. Still I couldn't fall asleep. My memory stubbornly pulled out images of a life that was still warm and silly. There were Sunday picnics where I learned to spin the hula hoop and my father laughed the loudest. There were boat trips where we pretended the wind was our music. Then came the meetings that smelled of tobacco smoke and empty promises of let's get back to normal. After the note came a silence as long as a bridge over a bay. Evelyn became my navigator. She didn't say trust me. She showed me the schedule. When I failed my first physics test, she didn't scold. She brought out a notebook and said, order first, then speed. Over time, that respect became a shield. The morning after the funeral began with the deafening clatter of boxes. I was going through Evelyn's folders: insurances, contracts, reports, neat signatures. In a separate pocket was the very envelope with the note. I didn't open it. There are documents that are read in the presence of law and memory. I put the envelope back and caught myself thinking, sometimes it is better to let the silence run its course. At that moment the intercom rang. Linda and Greg had brought a home-cooked meal, even though I hadn't invited them. The bag smelled of store-bought pasta and other people's expectations. They talked about how hard it is alone, about real family, about making the right moves. I listened and thought about Evelyn's formula. Feelings are not proof. Proof is evidence. When they left, the house was mine again. I went around the rooms like a captain after a storm, checking to make sure the boards were intact. In the study I found Evelyn's notebook. Stability is having a system. I had a system: work, people, order. If anyone is going to measure my life by the degree of related drama, I have a counteroffer. Be a guest and follow the house rules. I sent Nathan a summary of the day, made some tea, and tried to exhale. The night stood on tiptoe and stared out the window, as if waiting for me to make a mistake. By midnight I fell asleep. And already in my sleep I heard a click that could not be confused with anything. Memory had opened an old door that I did not know about. There was a fact lying there, evenly folded like a coat in a closet. I woke up, sat up on my bed, and realized that the puzzle that seemed impossible had a simple frame. And then I found out who had set it all up. Question for you. If the people who disappeared from your life came back with smiles and an offer of help, would you let them in at the table or leave them in the hallway? I agreed to dinner only because it was easier to sit down at the table once than to listen to complaints about my coldness. We met in a restaurant where the red booths remembered other people's anniversaries and divorces. The TV was blaring a soccer game without sound. The waitress with the badge, Linda, was carrying plates with the look of someone who has seen everything. My mother ordered a salad, my father ordered a burger, and I ordered patience. We want to help with the assets, Greg began, carefully unwrapping his napkin as if it were his diploma. You don't have to pull everything alone, do you? We have people we know in investments. And he paused. The house is under refinancing. You could close a couple accounts just for a little while. Linda nodded as if she were bringing them moral justification rather than food. I listened to them and noted how they juggled the words family and together, as if they were bonuses at the checkout counter. While Linda brought dessert, my mother moved on to the topic of health. The doctor recommends a spa. Your contribution would save the day. I pushed my plate away and said, I'm not a bank. They looked at me as if I'd ruined the family evening with my presence. I paid and tipped more generously than usual. Let the waitress get something out of this circus. On the way out, my father whispered, blood is forever. I replied, responsibility is too. Their faces at that moment resembled empty storefronts. Lights on, no merchandise. I went home and called Nathan Caldwell. He picked up the phone immediately, as if he were sitting with a notebook waiting. Record everything. Letters, calls, messages. No transfers. Your transparency is your shield. His calmness worked better than any sedative. I wrote everything down, and for the first time I realized that my lawyer was closer to my family than these two. But the night decided to play with my memory. It pulled me back to my high school years when life was divided into stages. The first was grammar school, where Evelyn would wake me up at 6 in the morning and make me run on the promenade. I hated her stopwatch but later realized that sound became the music of discipline. The second step was work. I came as a trainee at the company under someone else's name, counting cargo manifests and watching the port breathe in the dark. No one knew I was mine. The third step was voice. I spoke at the city council and demanded transparency for the port. When people applauded, I nearly cried, not from pride, but from being heard for the first time. The present didn't let me swim in the past for long. The next day my parents put on a show. A touching plea from the mother appeared on social media. The daughter we loved so much is now rich and cold. We only ask for a chance to rebuild the family. The post gathered hundreds of hearts and comments. Greg tapped people he knew. Calls, letters, accusations of ingratitude. The local community magazine offered the mother a column, How Relatives Become Strangers. They played the victim card masterfully. But I wasn't going to play their stage. I chose a different weapon, facts. At my request, the company accountant published the annual report and the auditor's letter. Amounts, deadlines, signatures, no emotion, just the truth. Stephanie Hayes, chief compliance officer and an old friend of mine, brought out a folder. Here are the insurances, here are your tuition payments. It's all documented. If they try to pull a fast one, we have plenty of answers. I smiled genuinely for the first time in days. My friend hadn't brought flowers, but proof, the best sign of respect. I knew their plan would go beyond a salad and a column in the paper. You don't feed a man like that, you let him play the role of martyr. Linda texted me quotes about forgiveness like an actress on a bad TV show. Greg would call at night and leave voicemails about creditors, and how he would have no choice. I listened and thought, they always had a choice, only they used it like a drunk driving. I decided to gather evidence as methodically as Evelyn had taught me to fold reports. I emailed every message to myself. Every call I logged in my notebook. I felt more like an investigator than a daughter. Investigators don't look for love, they look for facts. In a cafe near the office, I heard two women discussing my mother's column. Poor woman, her daughter abandoned her, one said. The other nodded. Money messes with people's heads. I wanted to shout. Money has nothing to do with it. But I smiled at the waitress and asked for more coffee. Sometimes silence is louder than any argument. At work, I saw coworkers whispering. Someone had obviously read my mother's posts. But instead of excuses, I put together a team. Everything you need to know about our company is posted on the website. People nodded. They didn't need confessions, they needed paychecks and reassurance. I gave them that. That night, Stephanie walked into the office again. She set a folder on the desk. Here are your student loan statements. Here are the doctor bills. All of these were paid for by Evelyn. I flipped through the pages and felt the past become tangible. It was confirmation that I hadn't made up my mind about her care. She really did pay, drive, treat, feed. And no one would ever make me believe otherwise. I walked out of the office and breathed in the cold air. It felt heavy in my chest, but not from pain, from clarity. I had a shield now, and if anyone tried to break through it with tears or columns, they would meet a paper wall stronger than any confessions. Toward evening, the phone rang. Greg spoke in a voice stretched like an old rubber band. You'll have a chance to show you're not a stale person. We want to settle this without scandal. I'll meet you at the lawyer's office. Linda added sweetly, we're only in favor of peace. Her voice tinkled with metallic string. I stood on the porch, watched the sunset, and remembered Evelyn's words. Feelings are not proof. Proof is evidence. It was this formula that kept me afloat. I ended the day with a short email to Nathan. A summary of events, screenshots of posts, a list of calls. I felt no rage, just clarity. They were playing drama and I was doing the bookkeeping. But still the thought swirled. If they can lie to the public so confidently, what will they tell me the next time I see them? Would you believe someone who left you with a note and came back for your house? I knew they wouldn't stop. People like that don't know how to lose. It's in their blood to rewrite the rules on the fly. When the summons came across the table, I wasn't even surprised. It wasn't an invitation. I sat across the table, wondering how much that haircut and the lawyer's watch had cost. Greg feigned sternness, but his fingers were tapping the table. Uncertainty gives away even the most courageous liars. My lawyer, Nathan, spoke calmly and without emotion, but his every word was more precise than a hammer. He laid out documents. Invoices, certificates, letters. Everything that confirmed that the parents were only biological donors in this story. I looked at the judge and tried to guess if he believed in their theater. Sometimes I thought he could barely contain his laughter. Especially when Linda got confused about dates, telling me how she paid for my classes. In her version, she was apparently both in Europe on vacation and at the cash register at school at the same time. I couldn't help but chuckle. The judge noticed this and made a note of it. Let him. Sarcasm is my armor. Because without it, everything that was happening could be taken too seriously, and then I would just collapse from the absurdity. The rumors crawled faster than the official records. There was a column in the paper with the headline, "When a Daughter Abandons Her Family." At a nearby store, the cashier asked, "Is it true you kicked your parents out?" I smiled and replied, "No, they found their own way out, I just didn't hold the door." The cashier looked embarrassed, but I noticed the man next to me snicker, hiding a chuckle. It seems sarcasm is becoming the universal currency of survival. In the evenings, I wrote letters to myself. Not for the court, not for the press, for memory. I described the smell of Vivian's house. A mixture of coffee and old books. I wrote how she taught me to read documents aloud, to hear the meaning, not just see the numbers. I wrote down her phrases so they wouldn't dissolve into the noise of this baloney. These letters became my silent protest. As long as I remembered her words, no court could cut her out of my life. One day after the session, Linda tried to move closer. "Can we talk without lawyers?" she asked in a sweet voice. I replied, "We can. But then I'll be the recorder." She recoiled as if I had hit her. I wasn't about to leave room for manipulation. Their words had always been a weapon. And while I had listened to them with hope before, now I listened to them only with cold caution. The hardest moment was when a box of photos was brought into the room. Greg held out the pictures to the judge. Here was a baby, here was a schoolgirl, here was our girl. They were trying to prove their love, with paper and cardboard frames. I looked at these pictures and felt a strange emptiness. Yes, there was me in the pictures. But next to them, I didn't remember the warmth. I remembered something else. Vivian sitting by my bedside at night when I had a fever, saved by her cool palms. No picture of them could erase that fact. As the session dragged on, I noticed fatigue even in the reporters. They were expecting blood, but instead they saw a boring parsing of bills and receipts. That's when Linda would turn on the tears again. "We just want to hug our daughter," she repeated. I sat quietly because I knew the truth was louder than any tears. And the truth was in Nathan's files and in my memory. The truth lived in my letters, which I put in my desk drawer and locked. Sometimes I had nightmares. I saw myself as a child again, standing on the porch waiting for my parents who didn't return. I would wake up in a cold sweat and sit at the window for a long time, watching the streetlights come on. At such times I wanted to ask Vivian, "Why are they back now?" And I would answer myself, "Because now you have something to lose." This thought was both searing and sobering. At the next meeting, Nathan asked them bluntly, "Why did you only think of your daughter after her success?" There was no answer. They looked at each other, and at that moment their mask cracked for the first time. I felt a strange satisfaction. The truth doesn't always shout, sometimes it whispers, and that whisper is louder than any performance. The trial was postponed until next month. I went outside and breathed in the cold air. The sky was gray. Cars were rushing about their business. People didn't know that a family drama with elements of farce was unfolding somewhere nearby. I stood there and thought, this is just the beginning. They would fight for the role of victims, and I would have to prove that I was not a villain but a survivor. And I was ready, because the moment loomed ahead when the truth would be too loud to be drowned out by even the most precious tears. And then, I found out who had set it all up. I noticed how they started coming in with more witnesses. Neighbors, distant relatives, even an acquaintance who swore she saw Linda taking care of me as a child. I listened and thought, I wonder who's next? Maybe my first tooth would be brought in as evidence? Each new face was part of the play, and the longer it went on, the less doubt remained. It wasn't about love, it was about control. About them hating the very existence of the fact. I lived without them. At some point, I decided to put their words to the test. I went to the neighborhood where I spent my childhood. The houses had aged, the fences had swayed, but the smell of asphalt after rain was the same. The neighbor, old Mrs. Harper, recognized me immediately. "Girl, I remember you standing alone on the porch," she said. There was more truth in her eyes than in all their lawyers' statements. I left there with a lump in my throat. Memory can lie, but witnessing silent nights never does. My sleep was becoming intermittent. Sometimes I woke up to my own screaming. I saw myself being made guilty again in the courtroom. In these dreams, the judge would bang his gavel and say, "Take it all back." And I realized that back meant being a child again, waiting at the door, believing in the impossible. But when I woke up, I reminded myself, there's no going back. That was their misfortune. They were stuck in a time where their role still made sense. At one of the sessions, I couldn't stand it for the first time and spoke bluntly. "You call this love? Love is not formalized through a lawyer. Love doesn't come with cameras. Love doesn't show up 20 years after you threw the baby out of the house." The room grew quiet, so quiet that I heard the reporter's pen click. Linda looked away, and Greg lost his mask of equanimity for the first time. And that's when I realized, the truth isn't documents. Truth is when they can't stand to hear your voice. Every night I sat down at my desk and opened the box of letters. They lay in neat stacks, and each word was like a nail that held my reality together so it wouldn't crumble. I knew there were more meetings to come. But I also knew, no matter how long the journey was, it had an end. And at that end would stand me, not their made-up victim.